Welcome to Redundancy Matters with me, June Hogan. I'm a qualified career coach and outplacement specialist, and I've got a background in HR. And this is the podcast where I help HR professionals and leaders managing redundancies to put people at the heart of the process. In today's episode, I'm going to talk through 5 common mistakes when managing redundancies, and most importantly, how you can avoid them. So the first one is lack of planning. This is where you lay the foundations for the whole process. And in the planning, sometimes you won't always have a lot of time to plan, but where possible, it's always good to build in as much time as you can in those planning stages. Because when planning is unclear or it's incomplete, it can create confusion during the implementation of a restructure. And ultimately, that can create more work for you as well. Because managers aren't sure what their responsibilities are, or people at risk maybe don't understand what's happening or why, and the whole process can become more stressful than it really needs to be. A lack of planning also means that the information shared during consultation meetings can be inaccurate sometimes or incomplete, and that's something that you really do want to avoid. The budgeting can also be unreliable as well if you haven't done the planning based off accurate data. And then there's limited time to arrange things like outplacement support. And of course, all of that can lead to legal complications as well. So over time, a poorly planned process can contribute to a dip in morale across the whole organisation. It creates more noise in the process than there needs to be. And ultimately, the individuals who are impacted by this, they need to know that you're in control of the process, because it's going to feel like everything is out of control for them. So they're going to be looking to you and have the confidence that you've got everything together. Okay, so how can you kind of avoid this then? Well, I said earlier that building in as much time with the planning as possible is important, and starting by developing a comprehensive plan. Because the more preparation you can do up front, the better, because when things are announced, it really does get super busy after that. So being clear on legal timeframes that you need to follow in line with the numbers of people that you've got at risk, because you really can't cut those short. And setting clear, measurable objectives and making sure that you've got the buy-in from your leadership team on those milestones. And importantly, on the amount of time the leadership team will need to commit to this process and what's involved. Because it's not a HR exercise, and it really does rely on line managers. So I'd recommend sharing the plan with the leadership team and explain what you can and can't flex. And do build in some contingency time, because if you've ever done a restructure, you'll know that things change and it can be a moving feast sometimes. So building in that slippage time, building in some contingency will be really helpful. Also including cost modelling in the planning. So cost modelling based on the costs and likely costs, because clearly at that stage you're not going to know who's going to be impacted and leaving the organisation. So looking at your workforce planning, your modelling, looking at how those proposals might impact the workforce, and particularly if it's going to impact people in protected groups, for example, it might be disproportionate, then you need to consider if this can be avoided or mitigated. And if it can't be, then importantly, documenting your decision, because you may need to rely on that later on. And then finally, deciding whether you need to consult with experts, because getting the advice early on can make a huge difference later, especially if you might be entering into a complicated process. Maybe you've got women on maternity leave, for example, or there's something that's high risk or something that's high volume and you're going to need some extra support and hands to help you. Another mistake is poor or unclear selection criteria. Because when selection criteria aren't robust and realistic or fair, then not only do people quickly perceive the process as unfair, but it can lead to legal challenges, including discrimination claims, and that can damage your organisational reputation. And of course, you'll see an increase in appeals and challenges from individuals who feel the process hasn't been handled correctly. So to avoid this, it's about considering the information that you already have and that you can actually rely on that is accurate. So for example, if you're going to use performance or skills data from your HR information system, but it's inconsistent or it's out of date, then you'll need to create a new selection framework to be able to bring things up to date. So you need to ask yourself what's genuinely fair, what's realistic. For example, absence can be used as long as the information is accurate and the criteria are non-discriminatory. But being clear about whatever you're going to use, who is going to carry out the assessment, you'll need somebody who can stand behind the decision and who knows the capabilities of the individuals, especially if you're doing a desktop exercise. Think about what kind of assessment. Will it be an assessment centre? Maybe you're going to use interviews. Will it be a skills assessment? And importantly, ensure that you build in training for the assessors, whatever type of processes that you decide to use, because you need to make sure that they understand their responsibilities and how to conduct the assessment fairly and consistently, and then decide how to moderate those decisions to ensure consistency. And importantly, have everything documented throughout the whole process. The rationale, the outcomes, and where possible, involve multiple people in the decision-making process and the moderation, because broader involvement often will lead to more balanced decisions. The third mistake is failing to consult properly. So when consultation isn't meaningful, that's when trust breaks down. It increases conflict, it can increase tension, it can damage relationships with your employee reps or trade union reps, and it significantly raises the risk of legal challenges related to unfair dismissal. But most importantly, when people at risk don't feel listened to, it becomes much harder for them to understand the situation or come to terms with their redundancy. So without careful consultation, the process can feel personal rather than procedural. So to avoid this, I'd recommend implementing structured and transparent consultation meetings. That's about allowing for feedback. Now, this is proper two-way communication. And again, when you're training and educating your line managers, making them aware that redundancy is not inevitable, that the consultation has to be meaningful. It has to be two-way, and people need and deserve to be listened to if they have representations or ideas and proposals to make. And it's about using the appropriate language around those proposals, because this is a proposal and it's not an outcome. It should never be presented as inevitable during consultation. And that needs to be reflected in your communications and where feedback and challenges and alternatives are suggested. Always ensure the feedback you give is timely and as quick as possible. Given the consultation arrangements and timings, of course, make sure every consultation meeting is documented and integrated into the decision-making process. Even the final consultation meeting, that's a part of the consultation process. And if new information or new alternatives have come to light, then it's important to consider those even up to the point the individual leaves the organisation. So the fourth mistake is not considering alternatives to redundancy, because when you skip this step, you can risk losing valuable skills, talent and experience. It can lead to higher costs later on, especially if you might need to recruit and retrain staff after redundancies have taken place. And over time, it does reduce employee loyalty and engagement if you're regularly making redundancies. So to avoid this, it's important to conduct a comprehensive review of all possible alternatives. They might include things like redeployment, retraining, flexible working, a freeze on recruitment in certain areas. These things don't have to be permanent. They can be for a period of time and then undertake another review of whether redundancies are still needed. So if you do move to announce redundancies, then all these options will form part of your redundancy rationale to show that you've been fully considered and that they're fully part of the business case. So it's important to evaluate the long-term impact of losing key skills, not just the short-term cost benefits. And also, if you engage with employees about their ideas for cost saving and efficiency savings, because they often have ideas or opportunities that you may not have considered. And also, their transferable skills could open up options that weren't initially obvious. So that's an important part to really understand what are the alternatives to redundancy and make sure those are fully considered and fully thought through before you announce. And then the final mistake can be incorrect pooling. When the redundancy pool is poorly defined, it can increase the risk of unfair dismissals and it opens up the door to discrimination claims. So, to help avoid this, it's essentially about widening the lens. Considering all employees doing similar or interchangeable work and not just the obvious or easiest groups of people to select. And then it's about applying objective criteria consistently across that pool and documenting the rationale about how that pool was defined. What you took into consideration, the roles that were defined as in scope and out of scope and why. Importantly, who was involved in making that decision. Because pooling is about identifying the group of employees who are doing the same or similar work and who should therefore be considered together when selecting roles for redundancy. But something that can happen is the pool is too narrowly defined. It's too small or not properly justified, and sometimes that can be because you're doing things prior to announcing, you're doing the preparation, you're looking at org charts, you're looking at the areas of focus, and people can tend to focus on the roles they're most familiar with, or the individuals that they think the changes should apply to, which clearly isn't the right way to go about it. So a properly defined pool needs to consider all employees doing similar work and not just those who you feel are closest to the proposed changes. So looking across the organisation at roles, not just within one team or reporting line, and then applying that consistent criteria. So for example, you might have a pool that's too narrow, a pool that's focused on one team instead of the work. Of course, you need to make sure that you're not bringing people into the pool unnecessarily. That is something that you need to watch out for. So those are just 5 common elements of a redundancy process that can go wrong, and when they do, they can cause problems for yourselves as HR professionals, and they can go wider than that and cause problems across the organisation. But most importantly, those mistakes will have an impact on the individuals who are at the centre of the process, and that's what's really important. So I hope that's been helpful. And if you want to read or listen to more ways to ensure you're leading fair and legally compliant processes, you can check out some of the other episodes on the podcast. There's lots of blogs on my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk. And of course, you can always join us for a monthly lunch and learn where we go deeper into all aspects of managing redundancies. And you'll find the link to that in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to the Redundancy Matters podcast. I hope you found today's episode helpful. It would mean a lot to me if you would follow, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, as this helps it reach more people who are managing redundancies. Let me know what you thought, and if you have ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn, June Hogan, and get in touch via my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk, where you'll also find more resources to help you manage redundancies. I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode of Redundancy Matters.